Hello, my name is Gabrielle Moore, and this is my presentation entitled A Cross-Generational Look at My Matrilineage, 100 Years of Progress. This is for Conflict 494, Cross-Generational Teams at Work. When I started thinking about generations and how they've impacted my own personal life, I was thinking about historians and how historians talk about the family tree. And I realized that just like a tree, growth occurs when a new branch buds out of an older branch. The new branch is unique and can go off in its own direction, but it still requires the support and genetic roadmap of the branches and the trunk that it came from. Just like generations are uniquely built upon the structure of those who came before them. Today, I will be taking a quick historical walk through 100 years of the women in my family, representing 4 very different generations. This is a picture. On the left is my grandmother, my mother, and I, circa 1977. And on the right is a picture of my mother, myself, and my daughter. These pictures were taken almost 45 years apart. So you may be saying to yourself, wait, I thought this was a class about cross-generational teams at work. Why would I look at family lineage? Great question. So why would I tell you about my matrilineage, and how would that help you understand cross-generational differences in the workplace? Also great questions. Well, to better understand cross-generational differences, you will need to understand the vastly different values and histories of the various generations you may have the opportunity to work with. As a leader, if you can understand how these generational differences affect how people speak, work, and find purpose in their work, you will be better equipped to help each team member feel uniquely valued. Heather Bates, an HR and recruitment specialist, wrote, "Interpersonal issues are often one of the biggest problems that employers face when dealing with generational diversity. When employees who are decades apart in age work closely together, they can sometimes have trouble getting along, not to mention that conflict reduces employee engagement and decreases productivity." In fact, we currently have potentially 5 generations in the workforce. And with advances in medicine and increases in life expectancy, we may see this number climb. Here is a look at the timeline of the last 100 years on my mother's side. My grandmother was born in 1897 and is considered part of the lost generation. My mother was born in 1935, I was born in 71, and my daughter was born in 1996. The term lost generation was coined by Gertrude Stein and referred to those born between 1883 and 1900 who came of age as World War I broke out. Here's a look at what many people today think of when we talk about the 1910s or 1920s, when my grandmother was coming of age. They thought of flappers and the Fitzgeralds and Ernest Hemingway and parties and Great Gatsby. But the reality for my family was in stark contrast to those glamorous images. Her family owned a small farm in Kansas, and 2 of her brothers went off to war, one of whom never came home. Times were hard on the family farm, and they were about to get worse. Dan Bryan, founder and editor of American History USA, said, "For them, the 1920s were hardly a golden age. On the contrary, there was an agricultural depression that lasted the entire decade and kept a noticeable divide in place between this class and the urban classes. The women of the farms made great sacrifices in this time just to keep their families underneath a roof." Just a note, that picture in the background is actually the census from 1910 from my grandmother's family. So my grandmother, again, raised in Kansas, she had very few career choices. She left high school in the 10th grade and found a job as a phone operator to help support the family. And then a few years later, much to her family's chagrin, at age 24, she married a 40-year-old widower who had 3 children already from a previous marriage. And then they began having children in 1924 together, with my mother being her last born in 1935. For my family, the characteristics of the lost generation, of course, much of this depends on where you lived and what your financial status was. As far as education, for women, it was unimportant. Women could continue in school and finish high school or not. Their families didn't really care as long as they worked after they got done. Morality, they were questioning. Career options, well, primarily were wife and mother. There were some pink collar options like teacher or nurse available as well. Emotions, well, they were very stoic, and their work ethic was very strong, and they had a very strong family obligation. Then, in 1935, along came my mother, Mary. Why were they called the silent generation? Well, according to Michael Connor, founder of CareerPlanner.com, those of the silent generation were born during the Great Depression. Their parents were mostly of the lost generation. They grew up expecting a hard life. This was the era when a Christmas present might be an orange or a full meal. They are called the silent generation because as a group, they were not loud. They did not protest in Washington. There were no major wars to protest. This was certainly the case for my mother's family. My mother remembers one particularly bleak Christmas when she received only a doll and her brother got a comb. My grandmother was abandoned by her husband and left to support 6 children by herself, and they lived in abject poverty. But as my mother grew up, she grew into adulthood, and also so grew the possibilities for women in their careers. Neil Howe, journalist at Forbes magazine, said the silent generation started out as the children of crisis. They grew up while older people were fighting wars and making great sacrifices on their behalf. They tiptoed cautiously in a post-crisis social order that no one wanted to disturb. When they went to a job interview, their first question was about pension plans. As for their characteristics of the silent generation or the traditionalists, education was pretty important. Women mostly graduated from high school. Almost all of my mother's siblings graduated from high school, and even one went on to college. As far as morality, there was a high respect for authority. Children were seen but not heard. Career choices, there was pink collar career choices like nursing, teaching, secretarial, retail, and then, of course, some women at this point went on to college, but that was not the case in the area that my mother was being raised. Very few women went on to college here in Idaho, where the people she grew up with. Emotions, they were raised by the Depression survivors, many of whom had suffered malnutrition, great sacrifice, probably abuse, verbal, physical, sexual, and probably struggled with mental health issues. I know my family probably did. They had a very strong sense of family obligation because of the desperate times, and a very strong work ethic. After graduating from high school, my mother went on to secretarial school and became a subservient secretary, which is basically what she did until she retired at age 65. This is an actual picture of her at a work function around 1960, I think. There was a double standard for men and women during this era. Men were seen as the head of the house and the king of the castle, whereas uneducated women like my mother went unseen. They were vulnerable to verbal and sexual abuse at the hands of their male employers. My mother became pregnant with me out of wedlock and was fired from her job for it. The man who impregnated her, who was probably in this picture or something like it, got off scot-free. My mother was able to buy her own home and live just above the poverty line as an unmarried woman. Then I came along in 1971, right in the middle of the Vietnam War, Roe v. Wade, and the Watergate crisis. All of this made for a very difficult time for our country. According to familyresearch.org, the X in Gen X was used to give the idea that this generation resisted being defined with reference to the variable X rather than some other characteristic. Generation X, or Gen X for short, was also known as the baby busters, the latchkey generation, and the post-boomers. Forbes magazine journalist Amy Wu said of Gen Xers, "Many of us grew up as latchkey kids with both parents working or as part of a divorced household. We witnessed the beginning of ATMs, started our careers around the dot-com boom and some busts as well. lugged around large cell phone suitcases, and reached adulthood just when the internet became a daily part of life. We saw the Berlin Wall fall, the Cold War end, and communism disintegrate. We saw the end of apartheid in South Africa, all to a backdrop of grunge and disillusionment. Well, this is me in the circa 1989. Characteristics of Gen Xers, education. Yeah, it was somewhat important. This had really changed. My mother had no expectation of going on to college, and she really didn't have any expectation that I would go on to college, but she was certainly open to it. It's somewhat important, and many of the people that I went to school with here in Boise valued education and went on to at least some college. Morality, there's certainly a fading of traditional values. Career opportunities, yes, definite increasing career opportunities over the previous generation. Emotional, we're skeptical. We're a skeptical bunch, but we are more in touch with our emotions. And work, well, we're very task oriented, and we do have a weakening work ethic because we are seeing that company loyalty is decreasing, and with it is our loyalty to our companies. Then along came my firstborn, my beautiful and talented daughter Haley, in 1996. Most journalists agree that the term millennial refers to those born around the change of the millennia. There are very few limitations for women born into this generation. There is a big push for women to explore STEM and other male-dominated careers. The wage gap is getting smaller, and fourth wave feminism is in full bloom. This here is a picture of my daughter at her college graduation in 2018. So characteristics of the millennial. Education, it is a very high priority. College, advanced degrees, but there is a slight change in the air that these folks are going into great amounts of debt to get their education, and they're starting to see people that have had college debt for decades and it never really paid off. So there is a slight change in the air about perhaps college isn't the answer for everyone. Morality, they're questioning everything. Career, there are virtually no limits in their career. Although there still is a wage gap, it is shrinking daily. Emotions, very high emotional IQ. These millennials are very in touch with their emotions, possibly to a fault, and they are very aware of mental health issues. As far as work, they prioritize life balance over career because they have seen prior generations give their lives to companies who turned on them at the last few years or treated their employees poorly. So they know that they prioritize work-life balance. A well-known journalist and CBS TV personality, Morley Safer, said, "The workplace has become a psychological battlefield, and the millennials have the upper hand because they are tech savvy with every gadget imaginable almost becoming an extension of their bodies. They multitask, talk, walk, listen, and type and text. And their priorities are simple. They come first." So true. Well, thank you for your time and attention looking at this 100 years of women in my family. There has been so much change. Same family, same basic values, but four very different women representing four very different generations. Thank you.